All right, folks, thanks for joining. We've got quite a few people rolling in. As you come into the webinar, just give us a shout out in the Q&A that you can see our screen and hear us okay. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. We'll probably start 1 or 2 minutes after 2 o'clock, just so everyone can get all the content today. Thank you again for joining. I see a couple questions coming in pertaining to the recording and the slides. We will distribute those after the fact. And we also will be giving out SHRM certification for those of you who stay on for the full length of this webinar. We should finish up the content about 45 minutes, 60 minutes after we start. So that's when we will distribute the code. So Christine, Peggy, Judith, thank you for joining. We've got a lot of great stuff for you today, and we will get started in just a few minutes. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining today. A lot of folks still coming on board. We are going to be talking about global HR compliance. And there's a little caveat to that. We're going to touch on some stuff inside the United States as well. So no matter where you are in the world today, we have some fantastic content pertaining to what's happened in the last year, as well as what to look ahead for. So my name is Alex Shammy. I am with Namely HR, all-in-one HR, payroll, and benefits software for mid-sized companies. I'm pleased to bring content to you today on behalf of my partner, Andy, who will be speaking for Namely, and Priya with Blue Marble, who processes global payroll anywhere around the world. We work closely together. A lot of customers use the Namely and Blue Marble in conjunction, as we're super focused with companies inside the United States. Just a little nuance to take note of before we move forward. So without further ado, I'm going to give you a little agenda for what we'll chat about today. You should see my screen flip to the next slide. Just let us know if that's all good, so we know that there are no technical difficulties and we can breeze through the content with no issues. So with that, today I'm going to touch on a little introduction just to set the stage of what we'll be chatting about, give a little background on workplace compliance, where we've been in the last year and where to look ahead towards. And next, I'm going to pass it off to Priya, who is a thought leader in the global workplace compliance space, and let her give you a rundown of what's happened and where we're headed. And then following that, we're going to dive deeper into the United States in a similar format. What's happened and where should we expect things to go in the coming year? And for that section, I'm going to pass it off to, as I mentioned, my colleague, good friend, and partner, Andy, who is the news team here at Namely. He is constantly following U.S. compliance news. He's writing breaking news on the HR news blog from Namely. So be sure to follow that if you like what you hear today and you want to stay up to date with what's happening in the world of compliance. And a couple notes before I introduce the speakers and give you a background is that we will be having a Q&A section after we summarize what we chatted about today. So please use the Q&A section throughout the course of this webinar. We will flag your question to answer live if our speakers find it relevant to the conversation and if they have some valuable insights to pass along to you today. Additionally, this webinar will be recorded. We'll send out the recording as well as a copy of the slide decks. So pay attention. No need to take vicious notes. You will get all the content delivered to your inbox after this webinar. And I think I just said lastly, but truly lastly, before we move on, there will be SHRM credit issued for those of you who stay on the webinar. But keep in mind, don't leave on this webinar because we're not allowed to distribute that credit in the recording. So you have to stay on for the length of this webinar to receive that credit. All right, that was a mouthful. So without further ado, I'm going to move forward and introduce our presenters today. As I mentioned, we have Andy Prstansky here on Namely side. He is the Senior HR and Compliance Content Specialist here at Namely, writes for HR News, constantly breaking new subject matter, watching the CNN ticker, waiting for new things to happen. So he has got some good stuff on the US side, inside the United States. And then next I've got Priya Licht, President and co-founder and global people strategist from Blue Marble, a thought leader in global workplace compliance. So without further ado, I'm going to set the stage today with a little background on kind of where we've been and where we look to go. So with the new administration in the United States, and as you all know, a wave of political changes globally, last year was full of twists and turns for HR professionals looking to keep up. From healthcare adjustments to new deadlines, the variety of laws and regulations to keep in mind for both global and US employees is immense. It's hard to keep up with. We all know that. However, proper compliance is instrumental in running smooth global business operations and avoiding penalties. For all you folks out there with people inside the US working globally, whether it be in the UK, EU, South America, it's tough to keep up with. And so that's the stage for today's webinar is how can you do that as an HR professional? So regardless of whether your company calls Washington or Warsaw home, HR professionals need to ensure that all their employment practices are compliant. In this webinar, we're going to recap employment law changes that occurred in the US and around the world in 2017, share a forecast of 2018, and hopefully provide actionable ways to prepare for compliance challenges moving forward. And before we move on, I just want to give a quick reminder on behalf of both Namely and Blue Marble that while the content of this presentation covers best practice and compliance trends, it's strictly informational and shouldn't be construed as legal advice. Always consult with the legal counsel before acting on any of these themes and best practices presented today. So with that, we've set the stage, and I want to pass it off to dive into the global side of workplace compliance to Priya. Priya, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And hopefully you can all hear me. So thanks once again to the Namely team and to all of the participants for attending. As Alex mentioned, I am the co-founder of a global compliance software, Global People Strategist, and also one of the heads of consulting with Blue Marble Payroll. I focus on international HR consulting, and I've been in the business for 20 years, which means that I'm always thinking about what is top of mind for an HR person today globally. So these next few slides will be addressing what I have found are the main concerns currently affecting global HR departments. And of course, as Alex indicated, do use the Q&A to ask questions, as they have come up in your individual lives as well. So in terms of the current state of global workplace compliance, what are the main themes that we see in terms of our consulting practice? We see that global HR departments need access to compliance information. And once they have access to that research, they need further access to the actual documents, so things like employment contracts and handbooks that make use of that information. And then finally, as with all HR departments, both in the US and globally, we want to make sure that we can use that information to mitigate risks and liabilities. So if we go to the next slide, What does it mean to have access to compliance information? As many of you know, if you have operated outside of the US, most countries have very elaborate and very stringent labor laws as compared to the ones we have here in the States. And many of them are more employee friendly than ones we are used to, which naturally then means, as we have found, that workers in those countries tend to be very aware of their rights and benefits. They will know if an employer is not providing the statutory minimum that they're supposed to. And also the legal instruments in these countries, so whether it's the Ministry of Labor or employment tribunals, they really are notorious for adjudicating in favor of the worker, which can be great for them, but tricky for us as the employer. And finally, it also means that, minimum statutory requirements are more numerous than we are used to in America. So, and what that means is that, it restricts an employer's flexibility by really mandating a floor for policies and benefits. So you as the employer may certainly provide above and beyond what's required, but what's required might be more than what you're providing to your employees in the States right now. Then moving on. So the next concern for HR departments is then to have HR documents with all of those minimum statutory compliance requirements so that you can effectively hire and retain staff locally. How many times have we as HR managers done all of the research, figured out what the requirements were, but really wish that we had templates for local employment contracts, termination contracts, employment handbooks, etc., that really took into account all of the requirements specifically for that particular country. And most countries have mandatory lists of items that must be included in a written employment contract. Forget about provisions, that have to be included in termination notices, for example. The risks associated with not including these items run not only to employee action against the employer, but also state and federal employment authorities and tribunals can assess fees and penalties for non-compliance. And they are starting to get more and more strict about that. So, which leads us to the next top concern for global staff, which is, how to mitigate the risks and liabilities of operating overseas. So, obviously access to information on local employment customs and best practices is very important, to make sure that you're minimizing risks. So not only is it important to know what employers are mandated by law to provide for their employees, it is equally crucial to know what your peer employers are doing for their staff in the region. So best practices, especially those that are above and beyond the minimum statutes, are important both as a competitive lens in order to attract the best and brightest talent in the market, but also it is another mitigator of risk in terms of brand management. And brand and reputation management, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, have really become a lot more important in this 24/7 news and social media aware environment. Missteps, both legal and behavioral, can really, quote unquote, blow up within a short period of time, making it difficult for your staff to focus on getting the work done. So being aware of do's and don'ts of a particular employment culture minimizes the chances of that happening. So what are some global challenges in maintaining compliance? Well, if we look at the first one that we are finding, in terms of what most of our clients are experiencing, is that it is important to make strategic decisions based on your location, right? So employers can no longer assume that if it works in the US, it must work abroad. Those management practices are long gone. So as you're making a strategic decision on location, you also need to think about, for example, what should the ideal split of expatriate staff versus host country national staff should be? What kind of benefits should you be offering beyond what the statutory minimums are? In terms of compensation, do you do a compensation benchmark within the local market to find out, what percent of market you want to be paying at? And all of this needs to be done well in advance of expanding your operations overseas. And you want to make sure that you're not assuming home-based costs. You need to consider the local infrastructure, whether it's the amount of time it takes to navigate the local bureaucracy or what your local tax obligations could be, for example. So there is, you also want to make sure that, for example, as you're looking at how many expatriates to bring into a country, for example, that you have them on US agreements, but with a very defined plan and strategy for transitioning them out or back home within a particular period of time. Because, as studies have found, expatriates can really cost the employer close to 3 times as much as a host country national. So go into it knowing that international assignments should have a natural shelf life. And then also do not assume all corporate and employer-related income taxes as US without thinking about what your local tax obligations would be. A lot of companies have been known to go into countries, especially those in emerging markets, thinking, they can just go with US taxes, let the local authority just know that, well, we're already paying taxes in the US, or, thinking that they can fly under the radar since so many of their peers are doing the same. But local authorities really are waking up to the fact that foreign employers have been operating in a gray area with no real accountability for too long. And frankly, foreign employers with expatriate staff in many countries can often be seen as a cash cow with local fiscal authorities who will not hesitate to put the spotlight on you if you aren't careful. So another challenge, of course, is keeping and maintaining access to up-to-date compliance information. So you want to ensure that your team has access to the most up-to-date information for all the countries where you operate. Because countries' laws, they change, and the more countries you operate in, the more attuned you have to be to the fluctuations in the global environment. So for example, many of our clients that operate, with operations in India, realize that India recently mandated a new maternity leave law, compelling employers to increase leave that's provided to affected employees from 12 weeks to 26 weeks, which is more than double. So having a heads up to new laws coming down the pike will really allow you to plan and budget for changes in your potential cost structure, because these things can be very expensive in the long run. There are software platforms that help you do that, so it is important for your success to find out about them and use one that fits your needs. And then finally, it is very important to expand your HR expertise in-house, making sure that you have the right mix of talent. This is all relatively new, and that is, what that means is that there isn't a ton of expertise in global human resources because it is naturally a highly localized profession. Most of the time we know the laws and customs of the country we operate in, perhaps the state, the region, or the province, but it is understandably a bit much to expect all of us to have, a broad-based, cross-border, almost encyclopedic knowledge of international labor laws. Even within a region such as the EU, it is hard to find HR professionals who are experts in the labor laws of more than 1 or 2 countries. So, as you are building your departments to address global operations, make sure you're establishing an HR infrastructure where you don't need to rely on individuals and their knowledge for your compliance needs. But even outside of HR, it is seldom that you get the same qualified opinion from a local attorney. So ensure that your HR department has access to as much reliable information as possible so they can intelligently weigh advice from local counsel and differentiate between what is a requirement and what is a best practice. So you want to be building in fail-safes and redundancies by standardizing access to global employment information through your use of applications and systems. I'm going to go into quickly a couple of case studies that were based on actual client problems that we have solved over the years based on specific challenges they were facing. The first one was in the area of regulatory change. The client was a large university operating in multiple countries. They had been in existence for a very long time. So we know that laws change, but the speed at which laws have been changing in certain markets like Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa, as well as the increased focus on enforcing those laws, really put the spotlight on employers who are operating there. So this client, this university who had been around for over 100 years, had faculty, researchers, and students in multiple countries who had been working there with no idea whether the visa that they came in under, the contract they were working under, the taxes they were paying, anything really, was in compliance with local rules or not. And so what they needed was access to the full scope of a country's regulations, kind of the entire table of contents, if you will, of the labor code that affected their ability to operate and employ staff there, so that they didn't run into problems with local authorities, and they could continue to work on their projects and maintain their brand and reputation. And then the other issue that we solved for other clients of ours was making sure that people got access to compliant and reliable documents. So, how many times have we wished that we could just spin up an employment contract in HR or a staff handbook that had all the statutory items that needed to be included, but also allowed for us as the employer to add our own touch, like maybe a CEO welcome note that reflected the company's culture. And to be able to do this without always having to work with an expensive local attorney. So one of our clients was in precisely this situation where their HR team was US based and they didn't even know where to begin to create an employment contract to hire people in country, much less a handbook, which is often mandatory in many countries. And then finally, you don't necessarily always need, a PhD level thesis on a country. You just want some quick information about their culture and laws. And so, sometimes when, as an employer, you're exploring overseas expansion, you just want to know, what is the basic information that it takes to operate there. So not a full-blown consultant or attorney engagement. One of our clients, a tech startup, was in exactly that same situation where they had a couple of people they were contemplating placing in Canada, and they just needed the over-under, if you will, on the costs and benefits of that decision. Now, these problems were all solved by us via a mixture of custom consulting and also software-based solution. But it is a high-level picture of the kinds of issues that we are seeing on a continuous basis. So before I wrap up this portion of the presentation, I wanted to leave you with some upcoming highlights on what new rumblings there are on the global landscape that you all should be on the lookout for. The first one is that, and all of this is in the realm of, kind of the broad bucket of the fact that there are changes across many jurisdictions. I mean, there are over 150 countries in the world, and it's very hard to keep track of the changes in all of the ministries of labor. But there is, there's a group called the International Labor Organization, and they go through a relatively stringent process by which, they keep tabs on what's going on in local parliaments and ministries of labor to ensure that they are maintaining within their database all of the changes that are coming down the pike. And then once they're actually ratified in those particular countries, they are published as such, within their platform. There are also jurisdictions with frequent review and revision, such as Haiti and India and many others. I mean, I mentioned India as an example earlier in the presentation. It is very important to have access, to these kind of updates so that you are on top of countries that do change their laws on a frequent basis. Brexit, of course, is going to be happening within the next couple of years, and that will affect the movement of talent and capital across massive economies. And those laws, may be in conflict across offices within the EU and across HR departments that you have. And then there will also be major changes that affect global operations, such as GDPR, which affect how the privacy of data is maintained. We're not going to go into all of this today, but we do plan to have another session in the very near future to discuss them in depth. So that wraps it up for the global portion. I'm now going to hand it over to Andy, who will speak to you about compliance in the US.
All right. Thanks so much, Priya. There's obviously quite a bit happening globally, but for those of us based in the US, we shouldn't feel just left out yet. There's been an equally, if not more, active past year on the compliance front. So, thankfully, we have a lot to talk about today. Just a little quick disclaimer. Earlier, our MC for today mentioned that I watch the CNN news ticker to get my sources. I also watch the Fox News ticker, so you'll get nothing but fair and balanced coverage today. So we've seen pretty much on every level in employment law, lots of activity. We've seen record high minimum wage laws, ban the box measures, as well as flexible scheduling laws. But for today's presentation, I've decided to hone in on these 5 key issues that stood out to me. These include the Affordable Care Act, which is more commonly known as Obamacare, the equal pay movement, and specific to that, salary history bans. We'll also touch on overtime reform, which per our data has ranked as the hottest topic in compliance 3 years running. And we'll also touch on paid family leave, and last but not least, immigration and work authorization. So without further ado, let's jump right in. All right, so if you're a fan of the ACA, last year was a bit of a thrill ride. We had dramatic moments and what seems like a dozen repeal efforts or so that nearly crossed the finish line but didn't just quite make it. There was that dramatic moment where John McCain came in at midnight into the Senate hall and gave his dramatic thumbs down vote. And then there was the Lindsey Graham Cassidy proposal that almost made it, but just couldn't get the buy-in it needed from his fellow senators. So after all was said and done, the only meaningful thing that happened to the ACA in 2017 was the repeal of the individual mandate. Now, if you recall, the individual mandate is the requirement that people buy insurance or face a tax penalty at the end of the year. That change came with Congress's tax reform bill in December. So, despite that being important, there's one thing employers really need to be mindful of. The employer mandate, or the requirement that you, as an employer, offer insurance if you have 50 or more full-time employees, has not changed. Likewise, your reporting requirements have not changed. You still need to file your 1095-C and 1094-C forms every year. One thing that did change, though, going into 2018, was the due date for these forms, right? So instead of the ACA reports being due on January 31st, like the Form W-2, they're now due March 2nd, just 2 days from now. So the IRS did cut employers a little bit of slack this year, but if the ACA is still in place next year, I don't think they'll get that opportunity again. So in terms of what else might happen in 2018, we don't have it on the slide, but one thing I do think you should look out for is a potential second attempt at repeal. Actually, at this point, it's more like a 17th attempt at repeal. There has been some talk of the Graham-Cassidy proposal making the rounds yet again, but Senate leadership seems to be less inclined to take up repeal again. So moving on to our bottom line here, employers should remain in a holding pattern and assume it'll be business as usual for now. ACA looks to be here for the time being, and I honestly don't think we'll see repeal this year with everything else that Congress is working on. All right, so moving on to our second topic, equal pay. So for decades now, gender pay discrimination has been illegal. But that's only the letter of the law. And as of this year, women in the US still earn only about 80 cents to the dollar. So the gap has remained more or less the same for decades. Now, at the federal level, there really hasn't been much progress in 2017. If you recall, in 2016, the EEOC had proposed potentially requiring businesses to include employee salary information in their annual EEO-1 reports. That proposal, while it just nearly came across to the finish line, the Trump administration turned it down in 2017, citing concerns that it was an administrative burden from employers and not the right way to approach equal pay. So while things were quiet at the federal level, they were anything but at the state and city level. We saw a new phenomenon take root, and that is the salary history ban. So the theory here behind these laws is that asking about an applicant's salary history potentially perpetuates pay disparities, right? So if you're determining future compensation based off of what somebody made in the past, that's only going to bias future compensation decisions. Now, we saw a number of jurisdictions take these laws up. Massachusetts was the first one, but then California followed, and the cities of New York and San Francisco were right behind them. We're already starting to see other places follow suit, with New Jersey and Maryland taking up laws just last month. So this is definitely here to stay for 2018. Now, my bottom line here on equal pay is that I still expect salary history bans to be among the hottest compliance trends going into 2018. If you haven't already, and even if you aren't in a jurisdiction where this is the letter of the law, consider potentially altering your approach to asking about compensation in the recruiting process. We'll touch on this as a tip later, but doing so is a great way to get ahead of these laws, because I do think this is becoming more of a norm, and potentially we'll see more cities and states to follow later in the year. All right, and we actually have a poll question right here. I'd be curious to find out how many of you currently ask about salary history in your recruiting process. We have the responses come in. It's actually pretty interesting so far. The majority of you actually at this point, I know the poll just started, but we're at 60% do not ask about salary history in the recruiting process, which is really interesting. So it does seem like employers are already getting ahead of some of these regulations. And I think just a few weeks ago, Amazon announced that it was phasing out the question as well. So very interesting there. So let's move on to our next compliance topic. And one of my favorites personally, overtime, right? So this is consistently ranked as one of our most popular topics. The reason it's one of my personal favorites is it's how I personally got started on the HR news beat. If you recall, in 2016, the Obama administration came very close to updating the threshold for the minimum wage to exempt somebody from overtime. And we went through a few back and forth moments, but long story short, the Obama administration's efforts to increase the salary threshold failed after a surprise 11th hour court injunction just days before the rules were supposed to take effect. And I remember that very fondly. That was 2 days before Thanksgiving. I was getting ready to take vacation, and boom, the HR scoop of the year came, and we had a plot twist in the overtime saga. So moving on to 2017, not much has really changed with overtime. We're still kind of in a holding pattern. The threshold still remains at 23,660, and anyone earning below that number must earn overtime. So that number has actually been in place since 2004, which is why many think it's ripe for a change. Our current Secretary of Labor, Alex Acosta, has publicly voiced support for increasing it to about 30 to 35K, but still a few years in now, or a year and a half in, nothing concrete has really come from the DOL. I don't know if anyone recalls this, but last spring, the DOL published a series of proposals out to the HR and payroll community on what to do with overtime. One of those proposals was pretty extreme. It was getting rid of the salary history, or not the salary history, the wages test altogether. Now, in 2018, I don't think something as extreme as that will come to fruition, but I do think that we will see a threshold increase. My guess is that it'll be around that 35K number. But really, if there's only one thing certain right now in the DOL, it's that nothing is certain, especially when it comes to overtime. So before jumping into kind of our key takeaway for this section, I know I touched on what happened with the overtime rule in 2016. Out of curiosity, who had to make compensation changes or classification decisions based off of that rule? We're sending out a poll right now. Oh, it's going back and forth. It's like watching the Kentucky Derby. All right. So about almost just shy of 30% did have to make changes, which is surprising because I know it was such a dramatic change to overtime rules, but that's really interesting to know. Thanks for sharing that. So moving on to our sort of bottom line when it comes to overtime regulations, while we are accustomed to seeing changes at the federal level when it comes to overtime, I do think we're going to see even bigger changes at the state and local level. So this might come as a surprise, but 20 states already have their own overtime rules. Most of these tend to be relatively minor alterations to the FLSA. You might see some states opting to follow the 8 hours per day model as opposed to the 40 hours per week. But we are seeing states starting to adopt their own salary threshold as well. New York and California already have their own wages tests in place, and those are actually pretty a dramatic departure from the federal, more than double. So pretty close to what the Obama administration was already proposing in 2016. And Philadelphia, actually, this is a bit of breaking news. Philadelphia is also considering a similar measure, and that just came down the wire last week. So more to come on overtime for sure, and this should be an exciting year. All right, so here's another hot trend, paid family and sick leave. So in the last 3 years, nearly 20 states and a few dozen cities have actively looked to adopt or bolster their existing mandates. But unlike some of the other areas of compliance we've covered today, it isn't necessarily all quiet on the federal level. Though paid leave hasn't historically been a Republican issue, what we're seeing is more and more Republican or GOP leaders taking a stand on paid leave, trying to implement some form of it anyway. One proposal still being hashed out as we speak is it's actually coming straight from Ivanka Trump and Senator Marco Rubio, both of whom have kind of made this an issue of theirs. And that proposal would allow new parents to dip into their Social Security benefits decades before retirement to fund their paid leave. Now, it's a start. I think that proposal will probably be a non-starter with Democrats, but it is worth mentioning because one is coming from the president's daughter, and two does seem to be gaining some momentum among Republican leaders. Another proposal that's actually being pioneered by the HR group SHRM takes a bit of a different approach. It says that if employers agree to offer a minimum amount of paid leave, they're immune from state and city requirements for paid leave, right? So effectively, it acts as a shield against local rules around leave. Now, while that may seem appealing on paper, there is a problem with that approach. So SHRM's law only requires that businesses offer about 20 days of paid leave. Now, if you compare that with New York State's program, which offers as much as 12 weeks, you can see a pretty significant discrepancy there. So definitely a lot going on at the federal level when it comes down to paid leave. I'm not sure if we'll see momentum going beyond 2018, but it's something to definitely keep an eye on. So our bottom line on paid leave is that while it's still unclear if Congress is going to seal the deal, so to speak, a safe bet is that states and cities will continue to do so. One thing that happened 2 years ago was San Francisco decided to pass its own paid leave ordinance that required employers to cover whatever the state program did not, right? So I believe California offers something akin to 55% or 60% paid leave. In San Francisco, employers have to cover whatever is left after the fact. So I do think we'll see similar measures like that being passed at some of the more liberal or blue cities across the country in spaces where you already do have existing paid leave. But I also think that you're going to see paid leave make headway in new areas as well. And this is also a bit of not necessarily breaking news because it's 2 weeks old, but Austin, Texas recently passed their own sick leave mandate, becoming the first city in Texas and actually the broader South to do that. So definitely a lot of progress on paid leave going into 2018 and 2019. Okay, so we've touched on a lot of areas of compliance so far, and I thought I would wrap with a topic that's not controversial at all: immigration. So unless you've decided to disconnect from the news, you probably know that immigration was a very hot topic in 2017. We had the travel bans that were announced in early 2017 that created a lot of uncertainty for businesses with workers across the country. All in all, there was actually one survey that found that 4 out of 5 employers believe that last year's events around immigration had a negative impact on the recruiting and retention efforts. And we actually have a poll around this question as well that I would love to hear your thoughts on. So we'll launch that right now. So has your organization been impacted by recent changes in immigration policy?
Andy, let's let this one run for 30 seconds. And for the folks who are live on the webinar, I'd love in the Q&A to take guesses as to what you think the results might be.
All right, great. So we've got some results in. We've got 79%, just shy of 80, who have said it hasn't yet affected them, but 23% say that it has. So really interesting. Everyone is feeling this differently, and I think this might change going into next year, and we'll touch on that in just a second. All right, so another thing that is on here that I haven't touched on yet, E-Verify enrollment spiked. We saw enrollment increase to 730,000 employers. If anyone doesn't know what E-Verify is, basically that's an online service that the government offers for free, where you can cross-reference an employee's I-9 with government records to confirm whether or not they're authorized to work. So definitely an interesting service and one that's gaining a lot of ground as concerns about immigration come to the fold. So, what should you expect in 2018? I think it's a safe bet that enforcement activity is going to surge. We're already sort of seeing that. In fact, ICE leadership has admitted as much, saying that it expected activity to jump 400% this year alone. So what does that mean for you as an employer? It probably means that the risk of a random I-9 audit has never been greater. We're seeing some of those workplace raids, as scary as they sound, take place early this year. So definitely reason to consider starting your own I-9 audits if you haven't already. At the legislative level, there's been a lot of renewed focus around E-Verify in particular. E-Verify is already required in a handful of states and cities across the country, and there's a lot of momentum around making it a federal requirement nationwide. I do think that this might be part of a broader immigration bundle. Obviously, Congress is still working that out, but E-Verify is a service that's gaining a lot in membership and a lot of interest nationwide. So when it comes down to our bottom line for immigration here, enforcement is going to go up. It already has, and ICE has basically said it was going to almost quadruple it. So if you haven't already, consider auditing your I-9s on a regular basis. Everyone's case is different. For some employers, that might be once a year. For some employers, that might be once every 2 years or maybe twice a year. It really depends on what you're comfortable with. I'd encourage you, if, again, this is not legal advice, but to go with outside counsel if this is your first time, someone who's specialized in I-9 auditing, just so you can, if worst case scenario, that audit does come from ICE, you can demonstrate good faith effort to stay compliant. All right, so that's definitely a lot to take in. I know that there's a lot going on across all aspects of compliance. So I decided to leave you with 3 action items, ways to stay ahead of the curve. So first off, I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about salary history bans. Wherever possible, try to stay ahead of employment law trends. If you see that salary history bans are being passed in states and cities surrounding your offices, but you don't yet have one in your jurisdiction, consider taking the next step and just reevaluating your interview process, right? If that's one example, right? So how much value do you get out of asking about past compensation? If your goal is really to just determine someone's salary based off of the going market rate of the job plus their experience, maybe salary history isn't that valuable to you. So that's just one example, but really consider adapting your policies ahead of the game when it comes to local compliance. Tip 2 is to focus on political change. I know it's tempting sometimes to just shut off the news, but as hard as that is, don't. As HR and payroll professionals, your jobs are deeply intertwined with politics in more ways than you know. Compliance is just the end result of legislation, meaning that what happens in Washington will be felt in the workplace. So we should all be political junkies here. Last but not least, you really need to build out a go-to source for compliance news if you haven't already. We have Namely's HR News listed here, but there are plenty of other great ones. A few of my favorites include SHRM, the APA, Jackson Lewis, Bloomberg BNA is a great one. A lot of the employment legal firms have great blogs as well. And I really do think you should develop that network of sources that you follow, right? So unlike what Alex suggested earlier, don't just watch the CNN news ticker. Diversify your sources and get the full picture of what's going on. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic back to our MC today, Mr. Alex Shammy.
All right. Well, thanks for the call out, Andy, and thank you, Priya, for the fantastic content. I think we've gotten a lot of questions rolling in the Q&A, and I think we'll take it back to the global side of things. Let Andy get a glass of water. Thank you, Andy, so much for the stuff that you brought today. A lot of great insights and feedback and questions in the Q&A. So with that, Priya, if you're up for it, I'm going to go ahead and ask one or two questions. We've got maybe a couple more. We've got questions rolling in, so we can get those answered before giving out the SHRM credit. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, so let's start at the top. One question that I saw roll in, which I thought was interesting, what are the top 3 pitfalls companies fall in when they enter new markets outside of the United States? I don't know if you have a list prepared, but I'm sure you can touch on a couple.
Yeah, when I saw that come in, I was like, oh no, only 3? There's so many pitfalls. But all joking aside, I mean, when a company is thinking about going overseas, and that's a great question, because you should always be thinking about, what the potential landmines are. The first one is making sure that you actually set up your company in the appropriate structure in the new location. So when you are thinking about how to register in a new country, making sure that you are working with the right partner to get your particular corporate structure, or if you're a nonprofit, the nonprofit structure done in the right way. Many countries have separate categories for, registering as a business versus as an employer versus as a nonprofit, so ensuring you're ticking off all the right boxes, providing all of the documentation on a timely basis, because many countries have bureaucracies that can take a long time to process this, and understanding, do you have the leeway to start operations while an application is in process or not? And if not, how long do you think it'll take? So working with the right partner to ensure that you have a time frame that you can plan for. Secondly, and this actually mirrors what we see here in the US as well, but I think because of the unfamiliarity with the labor compliance requirements overseas, we find a lot of employers struggle with, if we are not registered as an employer overseas, can I just hire somebody as a consultant or an independent contractor? I already know who I want to work with. They're great. They understand our business. I just want to get started, get the work done. and I don't want to have to wait for all of the paperwork to go through. Now, some countries, maybe you can do that, but it is very, very important to recognize that in most countries, it actually is reflective of how the rules work here, vis-a-vis, our internal revenue service, where there is a very clear delineation between what constitutes an employee versus what constitutes an independent contractor versus a consultant. As you can imagine, many countries have the same types of differentiators, where an employee, you have to have, categories like, is their work being defined by someone else? Are they in control of their own time? Or do they have an employee ID number or an employer ID number or a tax ID number that certifies that they can operate independently, where, let's say you just want to pay them a lump sum amount, you need to have backup that is audit proof, to make sure that that individual is remitting their taxes appropriately. Otherwise, you as the employer, will be responsible. And then finally, I would say that, to just go back to the realm of really gaining an understanding of what the compliance requirements are, what the cultural requirements are in country, we often find that a lot of US headquartered companies, just to kind of get things moving, and it's understandable, you don't want to wait for all the ducks to be in a row. You say, for example, well, we have an employment contract that we use, or an employment agreement that we use here because, and we're at will, so, we'll just use the same language. Or we have an employee handbook that works for our staff here, so we'll just use the same handbook for our staff overseas. And that, I would say, is something that, global employers really should avoid. There are lots of platforms, like the one that I said, we created, Global People Strategists, that really help you hone in on very country-specific language and requirements, but that are also customizable, so that, if you want to add your own language, and obviously visually, your own logos and things like that, but also, just make it look and feel like your own document, you are at that point then balancing between kind of your global requirements as an employer, where you want to maybe make sure that all your employees worldwide feel like they're part of one company, but yet you're also being respectful of the laws of the countries that you are operating in. So I would say that those are my votes for the top 3 pitfalls, if that helps.
All right. Thank you so much, Priya. So next question I have here might be for Andy. We'll flip over to the US side. Any suggestions on getting around salary history bans?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There are a few different ways. So most of the laws don't have language around asking straight up about expectations, right? So what is somebody expecting out of the role? That's one way to get kind of a sense of where they are salary-wise, or what they're looking for. The other thing you can do is actually in California with their salary history ban, the employer can provide the salary range up front, right? And in California, that's actually the requirement. If a candidate asks for that information, you have to provide it as part of the interview process. So those are just 2 ways that you can potentially get past those laws and still get the information you need and be able to provide the candidate with the compensation ultimately that works for them and is what they want.
Great. And I know we had, I know you touched on I-9 audits, but we had one question roll in that I wanted to ask you. How often should I-9 audits be conducted to ensure compliance?
So I think generally once a year is a good call. Obviously, it depends on how many employees you have, right? So if you're an employer with 1,000 plus I-9s, it's a bit more of a challenge to do that. But if you're under that number or around 100 to 900, I do think it's something that you should jump into. If you haven't ever run an I-9 audit, now's as good of a time as any, especially with talk of increased enforcement. So I think the general rule of thumb there is once a year.
Perfect. And we had a bunch of other questions that we can follow up individually on. Like I said at the beginning, we did disclaim that we don't offer legal